Welcome to today's story. It's a tale that will make you pause and reflect. One that revolves around the harsh realities of racial discrimination, the fight for justice, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It's the story of Maxwell Hudson, a man who inherited a business that was built on the sweat of countless workers, but also on the exploitation of the marginalized. Today, we begin his journey, one that would forever change him and the lives of those around him. It was a cold morning in New York, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and makes you long for warmth. Maxwell Hudson stood by the large window of his penthouse, looking down at the city below. The streets were filled with people rushing about, each with their own story, their own struggle. For Maxwell, the world had always seemed like a chessboard. His family's wealth and power allowed him to move the pieces in ways others couldn't. But now, as he gazed out over the skyline, something in him shifted. His father's death had left him with the responsibility of the Hudson Enterprises, a business empire built on the backs of workers who were paid little for their labor, many of whom were from the most disenfranchised communities in New York. "Maxwell, you need to take charge," his lawyer had told him just days before. "Your father's legacy must be upheld. You can't just let it crumble." But Maxwell had never felt less certain. His father had built the empire with his sharp business mind and his disregard for the people who made it all possible. Maxwell had always admired his father's success. But now, the weight of it all felt suffocating. What was it worth if it came at the cost of human dignity? As Maxwell stood there, contemplating the future, a sudden knock at the door broke his thoughts. He turned, and his assistant, Jessica Brooks, stepped into the room. She was the one person in the office who had always shown him respect, despite his wealth and the way he had lived his life up until that point. "Maxwell, there's someone here to see you. He insists that you hear him out," Jessica said, her voice cautious but firm. Maxwell frowned, adjusting his tie as he made his way to the door. He was about to dismiss the visitor when he saw the man standing in front of him, a tall, imposing figure with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. It was Noah Adams, a former worker from one of Hudson Enterprises' most troubled factories in Harlem. "Mr. Hudson, I'm here to talk to you about your father's business practices," Noah said, his voice steady but filled with an unshakable resolve. Maxwell felt a strange tension in the air. He had heard of Noah before. He had been an outspoken advocate for the rights of the workers, leading protests and demanding better conditions. But he had never met him in person. "I'm listening," Maxwell said reluctantly, stepping aside to let Noah enter the office. The conversation that followed would change the course of Maxwell's life forever. Noah spoke of the struggles that workers in Hudson Enterprises had faced for years. They were forced to work long hours in unsafe conditions, their wages barely enough to support their families. He talked about the families in Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens, where people of color were subjected to unfair treatment, simply because they had no power to fight back. As Noah spoke, Maxwell felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had heard of the protests, seen the headlines, but he had never truly understood the suffering that so many had endured. His family's wealth had shielded him from these realities. But now, as Noah recounted the stories of injustice and hardship, Maxwell couldn't ignore the truth any longer. "You don't understand, Mr. Hudson," Noah said, his eyes narrowing with determination. "Your father built this empire on the backs of people like me. And now that he's gone, it's up to you to decide what kind of man you want to be." Maxwell took a step back, his mind racing. The walls of his penthouse, once a symbol of success and power, now felt like a prison. He had inherited more than just a business. He had inherited a legacy of exploitation, of turning a blind eye to the suffering of others. "What do you want from me?" Maxwell asked, his voice quieter now. Noah didn't flinch. "I want you to use your power to make things right," he said simply. "I want you to stop the injustice. You have the ability to change the lives of the people who work for you. Will you do it?" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Maxwell felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had spent his entire life chasing after success, never once questioning how it was achieved. But now, he realized that true success wasn't about wealth or power, it was about making a difference. Standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. After Noah left, Maxwell sat at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him. The decision weighed on him. He could continue running the business as his father had, perpetuating the cycle of injustice. Or he could make a bold change, one that would require him to confront the ghosts of his family's past. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't dialed in years. The voice on the other end of the line answered. "Jessica, I need your help," Maxwell said, his voice firm with resolve. "We're going to make some changes around here. It's time for us to do what's right." After the conversation with Noah Adams, Maxwell Hudson found himself in a state of confusion. Yet something deep within him had shifted. He had spent his entire life comfortably ensconced in the privilege of wealth and power. But now, facing the truth about the injustices of his father's empire, he couldn't turn away. Noah's words echoed in his mind. "You have the ability to change the lives of the people who work for you. Will you do it?" As the days passed, Maxwell couldn't help but feel the weight of those words. He had inherited a legacy of exploitation. His father had built Hudson Enterprises on the backs of hard-working men and women, many of them from marginalized communities in New York, including Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens. But now, Maxwell was at a crossroads. He had the chance to make a real difference, to reshape the company, to stand up for the people his father had ignored, and to bring real justice to those who had suffered for too long. His mind raced as he tried to figure out where to start. There was so much to change, so much to undo, and it all seemed impossible. But one thing was clear, he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, someone who understood the struggles of the workers and could guide him on this path of redemption. He thought of Jessica Brooks, his assistant, who had been with him for years. She had always treated him with respect, even when others were either intimidated by his wealth or skeptical of his intentions. But what Maxwell didn't realize was that Jessica had been quietly observing the injustices within Hudson Enterprises and had longed for someone with enough power to bring about real change. She knew the workers' struggles. She had seen them fight for better conditions. And now, she saw an opportunity to make a difference. It was late in the afternoon when Maxwell called Jessica into his office. She stepped inside, her expression professional but with a hint of curiosity. She had sensed that something had changed in Maxwell after his meeting with Noah Adams. But she didn't know what exactly was going on in his mind. "Jessica, I need you to help me make a plan," Maxwell said, his voice calm but determined. "I want to turn this company around. We need to put an end to the exploitation and the injustice that's been happening for too long." Jessica raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You mean, your father's business practices?" she asked. Cautiously. "Yes," Maxwell replied, nodding slowly. "I know now that it's not enough to just maintain the status quo. We need to do more than just run a successful business. We need to make sure that the people who work for us are treated with dignity, that they're paid fairly, and that they have the support they need to thrive." A mixture of hope and disbelief crossed Jessica's face. She had heard rumblings of Maxwell's discomfort with his father's legacy, but hearing him speak so openly about change was something she hadn't expected. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Jessica asked, her voice soft but filled with respect. "I am," Maxwell said firmly. "I can't change the past, but I can change the future. And I'm going to start by reaching out to the workers, those in Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens, the ones who have been the backbone of this company. They deserve better, and it's time we give it to them." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings and plans. Maxwell and Jessica worked together to devise a strategy to engage with the workers. They reached out to Noah Adams, asking him to help facilitate the conversations between Hudson Enterprises and the people in the communities where the company had been operating for decades. Noah, who had once been a labor leader fighting against the injustices of the company, agreed to help Maxwell despite his skepticism. He wasn't sure whether this was just another attempt by a wealthy businessman to assuage his guilt. But he saw the sincerity in Maxwell's eyes and agreed to give him a chance. They arranged a town hall meeting in Harlem, the heart of the community most affected by Hudson Enterprises practices. As the day of the meeting approached, Maxwell felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew that this was the first step in a long and difficult journey. The workers had been mistreated for so long, and he wasn't sure if they would trust him, or if they would even believe that he was sincere. On the day of the meeting, the large community center in Harlem was filled with people, their faces a mix of skepticism and hope. Maxwell stood at the front, his heart racing as he looked out over the crowd. Noah stood beside him, his arms crossed, observing the room carefully. When Maxwell began to speak, his voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I know that I have a lot to prove," he began. "I inherited a company that has a history of exploiting people like you, hardworking men and women who deserve respect, fair wages, and a chance to live with dignity. But I'm here today to tell you that I want to change that. I want to make things right." The room was silent, and Maxwell felt the weight of the moment. He continued, "I can't undo the past. But I promise you this. We are going to change how Hudson Enterprises operates. You will have a voice in this company. You will have a say in your working conditions. And you will be paid fairly for the work you do. This is the beginning of a new chapter, one where we work together, not against each other." For a moment, there was no response, and Maxwell began to worry that his words had fallen on deaf ears. But then, a hand shot up from the back of the room. It was Mary Jenkins, a longtime worker from Queens who had been one of the most vocal critics of the company's practices. "I've been working for Hudson Enterprises for over 20 years, Mary said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've seen so many of my colleagues struggle. And I've seen so many families torn apart because of the wages we're paid. It's hard to believe that someone like you, with your wealth and power, can actually change things, but I'm willing to listen. We all are." The room was filled with murmurs of agreement, and Maxwell felt a surge of hope. He had a long road ahead of him, but this was the first step toward redemption, not just for him, but for everyone who had been affected by the greed and injustice of his father's empire. The town hall meeting in Harlem was just the beginning of Maxwell Hudson's transformation. As he left the community center, a sense of determination surged within him, but he knew the journey ahead would be difficult. Noah Adams had agreed to assist in rallying the workers. But deep down, Maxwell could feel the skepticism in the air. These people had been betrayed for years, and trust was not something that could be built overnight. For the next few weeks, Maxwell and Jessica Brooks worked tirelessly, meeting with union leaders, community activists, and workers from Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens. Each conversation, each encounter, was filled with tension, but amidst the anger, there were also moments of hope, small flickers of belief that change was possible. One evening, Maxwell sat in his office, staring at the documents scattered before him. He was preparing a proposal to raise wages for the workers, improve working conditions, and provide healthcare benefits. He knew that the first step toward earning their trust was to make these changes, and to make them quickly. "Maxwell, we've got a problem," Jessica said as she entered the office, her face serious. "The board is pushing back. They don't want to approve the budget for these changes. They're saying it's too costly, that we'll lose profit." Maxwell looked up, frustration creeping into his voice. "I don't care about profit. This is about doing what's right. We can't continue running this company like it's just a business. These people, these workers, they're not commodities." "I know," Jessica said, sitting down across from him. "But the board doesn't see it that way. They don't believe the changes will make any difference." Maxwell leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressed against his temples. He knew this was going to be the hardest part of the journey, convincing the people who had always benefited from Hudson Enterprises' practices to agree to the changes he was proposing. But he wasn't going to give up. "Not now. I'll speak with them tomorrow," he said, his voice firm. "I'll make them see that this is the only way forward." The next day, Maxwell stood before the board of directors, each one seated at the long table, their eyes filled with skepticism. He could feel the weight of their disapproval, but he refused to let it sway him. "Gentlemen and ladies," Maxwell began, his voice steady, "I've heard your concerns about the financial impact of these changes. But let me make something clear. We've been operating on the backs of people who have been treated unfairly for far too long. It's time we start making this company one that people can be proud of. We have a chance to change the world, to set an example for other businesses. We're not just talking about profits anymore, we're talking about doing what's right." One of the board members, Henry Marks, an older man with a stern expression, spoke up. "Maxwell, you're asking us to take a huge risk. The workers won't suddenly change their loyalty just because you offer them a raise or benefits. They've been angry for years." Maxwell nodded, understanding the hesitation. "I know it's going to take time, but if we don't make these changes now, we'll lose the support of our workers forever. The protests and strikes will only grow stronger. And let's not forget the negative press. The world is watching us. Another board member, Lisa Franklin, shifted in her seat, her expression thoughtful. "You're asking us to bet on something that might not work. These changes could put our company in jeopardy." Maxwell didn't back down. "I'm not asking you to bet. I'm asking you to do what's right. And if we're going to continue building this company for future generations, we have to lead with integrity." The room fell silent for a moment, as the board members exchanged glances. Finally, Henry Marks spoke again, his tone softer this time. "All right, Maxwell," he said with a sigh. "We'll approve the budget for now. But understand, if this doesn't work, you'll have a lot of explaining to do." Maxwell nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "Thank you. I won't let you down." With the approval of the board, Maxwell Hudson wasted no time in implementing the changes. The first initiative was a company-wide pay raise, followed by improvements in health and safety standards. He also set up a fund for worker education and skills development, ensuring that everyone who worked for Hudson Enterprises had a chance to improve their lives. Over the following months, there was resistance. As expected, some workers were still hesitant to trust Maxwell. After all, his family's wealth and power had always been a symbol of inequality. But slowly, the changes began to take root. Workers in Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens started to feel the impact. They noticed the pay raises, the improved conditions, and the respect they were being shown. Slowly, their skepticism began to fade. One day, Noah Adams called Maxwell with some good news. "Maxwell, the workers in Harlem are talking," Noah said, his voice filled with pride. "They're starting to believe in what you're doing. They're not just protesting anymore, they're organizing." A sense of pride filled Maxwell's chest. "That's great news. I'm glad they're starting to see that we're serious." But Noah's voice grew more serious. "There's still a long way to go. There are some people in the community who are still not convinced. They need to see more than just words and promises. They need to see action." Maxwell Hudson knew that Noah was right. The journey was far from over, and there were many obstacles ahead. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer just the heir to a business empire. He was a man on a mission to make things right. As the weeks went by, Maxwell spent more time in Harlem, meeting with workers, listening to their stories, and making sure they knew he was there to support them. The progress was slow, but it was real. The seeds of change were being planted, and he knew that with hard work and determination, they would grow into something powerful. The journey to change had been long and full of challenges, but Maxwell Hudson was determined to see it through. With each passing day, the momentum for transformation grew stronger within Hudson Enterprises. Workers across Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens began to believe in the new direction Maxwell was charting for the company. But there was still much to be done. Maxwell had kept his promise to Noah Adams, Jessica Brooks, and the workers. Hudson Enterprises had begun offering health benefits, paid sick leave, and even educational opportunities for employees. The pay raise was one of the first steps, but it was the small, personal actions that made the biggest difference. Maxwell had personally visited the factories in Harlem, shaking hands with the workers, hearing their stories, and acknowledging their struggles. Still, not everyone was convinced. Despite the positive changes, there were skeptics, especially those who had worked for Hudson Enterprises under the shadow of Maxwell's father's ruthless leadership. Some believed Maxwell was only making these changes for show, hoping to win favor with the public. The resistance came in many forms, from quiet criticism to outright opposition. But Maxwell had learned over the past few months that he had to stay the course. The hard truth was that change was not something people easily accepted, especially when it meant turning a system that had benefited some for so long on its head. One evening, Maxwell received a call from Noah Adams. The tone in his voice immediately signaled trouble. "Maxwell, we have a problem," Noah said urgently. "Some of the old guards at Hudson Enterprises are organizing behind your back. They're not happy with the changes." Maxwell's heart sank. He had known that resistance was inevitable, but he hadn't expected it to be this organized. "What kind of problem are we dealing with?" "It's bad, Maxwell. They're planning to take this to the public. If they're successful, it could undo everything we've worked for," Noah said, his voice grim. Maxwell gripped the edge of his desk, his mind racing. He had been prepared for protests and obstacles. But this was different. The stakes were higher now. His vision for a better Hudson Enterprises was at risk. And so were the lives of those who depended on the company for a fair wage, decent working conditions, and hope for a better future. "I need to stop this before it goes any further," Maxwell said, his voice steady with resolve. "I'll meet with them tomorrow." The next day, Maxwell Hudson entered the Hudson Enterprises boardroom, facing the same people who had once cheered for his father's hardline tactics. But today, he wasn't just the son of Richard Hudson, he was a man on a mission, determined to protect the workers who had suffered for too long. The board members were already seated, their expressions tight and full of distrust. Henry Marks, the head of the board, was the first to speak. "Maxwell, we've been patient with your ideas, but you've gone too far now. These changes you're making, they're hurting the business. You're alienating our loyal customers and partners. We need to go back to the old ways." Maxwell stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "I won't go back to the old ways. The old ways are what got us into this mess. Hudson Enterprises has been built on exploitation for too long, and I won't let that continue under my leadership." Henry Marks sneered, leaning forward. "You're a fool, Maxwell. You're not running a charity. You're running a business. If you keep up with these humanitarian efforts, we'll lose everything. Don't you see that?" Maxwell felt a surge of frustration, but he remained calm. "I see that, Henry, but I also see a company that has the chance to do something better. We can succeed, and we can do right by the people who built this company. I'm not giving up on them." There was silence in the room, and for a moment, Maxwell wasn't sure if he had made the right decision. But then, he remembered the workers in Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens, the families who relied on Hudson Enterprises for their livelihoods. This wasn't just about profit anymore. This was about making a lasting change. "You can either support me in this new vision, or you can walk away," Maxwell continued, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "But understand this. If you try to stop me, I'll make sure the world knows exactly who's trying to hold us back." The boardroom was filled with tense silence. But slowly, the other members began to speak up. Lisa Franklin, one of the younger board members who had initially been skeptical of Maxwell's changes, raised her hand. "I agree with Maxwell," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is about more than just profits. This is about showing the world that we can do better. We need to be on the right side of history." Henry Marks looked at her, his face contorted with anger. "You've lost your mind," he muttered under his breath. But Maxwell could see that others were beginning to nod in agreement. The tide was slowly turning. There was still resistance, but Maxwell had made his stand, and he wasn't going to back down. As the meeting ended, Maxwell knew there was more work to be done. The battle for change was far from over. He had won the board's approval for now, but there would be more challenges ahead, especially from the outside world. The media was already picking up the story of Hudson Enterprises' shift toward better treatment of workers. And Maxwell knew that the critics would be relentless. But as he left the boardroom, he felt a sense of pride that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he wasn't just running a business, he was leading a movement. He was changing the world, one step at a time. Back at Hudson Enterprises, workers were beginning to notice the difference. Noah Adams continued to organize, making sure that the workers' voices were heard. Jessica Brooks worked tirelessly behind the scenes, making sure that the changes were implemented smoothly and effectively. And as for Maxwell Hudson, he continued to face the challenges head-on, knowing that true change would take time. But with each passing day, he saw the results of his efforts. Workers had better lives. The company had a better reputation, and he had begun to forge a legacy of justice and compassion, one that would outlast his father's empire. In the end, Maxwell Hudson learned that true leadership doesn't come from power, it comes from the courage to do what's right. Even when it's difficult, the fight for justice is never easy. But with determination and support, even the most entrenched systems can be changed. This is the story of one man's journey toward redemption, and the lives he touched along the way.